Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're peeling back the layers on something really fascinating. The Apollo 11 moon landing.
Right. But not just the history book version.
No, exactly. We're looking at that persistent, decades-long theory. The shadow, really, that it was all a hoax.
And we're using insights from Dr. Evelyn Carver here. She's an astrophysicist who wrote Lunar Lies, the Apollo Enigma. She's really dug into why people still doubt it.
Yeah, so our mission, kind of, is to unpack those claims, look at the weird anomalies people point to, and, try to understand why this thing just won't go away, all based on Dr. Carver's work.
Right. And it's probably good to start with the basics, Apollo 11, July 20th, 1969.
Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, first steps on the moon. I mean, it was this huge moment, global awe.
A massive achievement, yeah. And a huge win in the Cold War space race for the U.S. A real symbol.
Absolutely, a symbol. So the puzzle Dr. Carver tackles is, why, despite all that, does this hoax idea hang around, even now, in 2025?
Well, she talks about its allure, questioning something that seems almost impossible. People wonder, did we really have the tech back in the 60s?
And the Van Allen belts come up.
Definitely. The radiation. And then there are the photos. People see things that look off, anomalies.
It's not just a tiny fringe thing either, is it? I think Dr. Carver mentioned a poll.
Yeah, a 2019 poll found that 6% of Americans still think the landing was staged.
6%? That's millions of people.
It is. Dr. Carver calls it a shadow behind the flag, that doubt.
A shadow behind the flag.
Yeah.
I like that. So let's get into the core argument then. What's the basic claim, according to Dr. Carver?
Fundamentally, it's that NASA was under just immense pressure. Win the space race, beat the Soviets.
Right.
And the theory is they couldn't actually do it safely in '69. The tech wasn't quite there, so they faked it.
Faked it where? Area 51, a movie set?
Those are the usual suspects, yeah. Area 51 or some huge Hollywood soundstage.
Okay, so that leads us to the specific things people point to. The evidence, or lack thereof, the anomalies. Dr. Carver walked through quite a few. Where is a good place to start?
I think the flag is often the first thing people notice. You see that footage, the U.S. flag on the moon.
And it looks like it's waving, rippling.
Exactly. And the skeptical point is obvious. Hang on, there's no air on the moon. It's a vacuum.
So no wind? If the flag looks like it's waving in a breeze, it must have been filmed on Earth, right? That's the argument?
That's the argument. Now, Dr. Carver lays out NASA's explanation. It's got two main points.
Okay.
First, the ripple isn't wind. It's inertia. The flag was mounted on a telescopic pole with a horizontal bar to make it hang out. They had trouble extending it fully, apparently, so it got bunched up. And when they twisted the pole into the ground, that movement made the fabric ripple.
Okay. Inertia. What's the second part?
The second part addresses the shadows. Sometimes skeptics say the flag's shadow looks wrong, or isn't there in some photos. NASA says the lunar surface is really uneven, and that distorts shadows.
So physics and bumpy ground. But for the skeptics, it just looks like wind. And the weird shadow adds to the idea of, like, studio spotlights.
Precisely. Artificial lighting. It's amazing how one image, the flag, can be interpreted in such completely opposite ways.
Yeah. And that connects to the next point, right? The shadows in general.
Definitely. This is a big one for visual evidence, folks. They look at photos from the missions.
And the shadows aren't parallel.
Yeah. The argument is the sun is the only major light source up there, millions of miles away. Its rays should be essentially parallel.
So all shadows should point in the same direction, more or less.
Right. But in some famous photos, like Buzz Aldrin standing near the lunar module, his shadow seems to go off at a different angle than the module's shadow.
Which suggests?
Multiple light sources, like you'd have in a photo studio, spotlights, fill lights, again, pointing to a staged scene.
Okay, so what's NASA's counter to that, as Dr. Carver presented it?
It comes back to the lunar surface again. It's not perfectly black or absorbent. The regolith, the soil, it's actually quite reflective. It has a high albedo.
Meaning it bounces sunlight around.
Exactly. NASA says this reflected sunlight acts like a secondary light source, filling in shadows and affecting their angles, making them appear non-parallel even with just the sun shining.
Okay, so reflected light explains the wonky angles. But again, if you're skeptical, that visual of non-parallel shadows is pretty powerful. It just screams studio.
It does. It's visually immediate.
What about looking up? The sky.
Ah, the missing stars. Another classic point.
The argument being, no atmosphere on the moon means no haze, no light scattering.
So the stars should be incredibly bright and clear, right?
Yeah.
Even during the lunar day against the black sky, you should see thousands of them.
But when you look at the official Apollo photos,
The sky is totally black, blank. empty, no stars anywhere.
And the skeptical explanation.
As Dr. Carver outlines it, it's back to the studio set idea. The set was lit so brightly by these supposed studio lights
That the cameras couldn't pick up the fainter light of the stars, like trying to see stars from a brightly lit city.
Exactly that. The exposure settings needed for the brightly lit foreground, the astronauts, the module, the surface, would have been too short, or the aperture too small to capture the distant stars. Interestingly, Dr. Carver's interview didn't detail a specific NASA counter for this, just the skeptical claim tied to lighting.
Okay, moving away from the photos for a second.
Yeah.
What about the journey itself, the dangers? You mentioned the Van Allen belts earlier.
Yes, this is a more technical point, but it sounds serious. These are belts of intense radiation trapped by Earth's magnetic field.
And skeptics say astronauts flying through them would have gotten, what? A lethal dose.
That's the claim. Either a lethal dose of radiation for the astronauts, or at least enough to fog or destroy the photographic film they were carrying. Dr. Carver mentioned a 1969 report that actually estimated a potentially fatal dose for a mission lasting around 12 days, like Apollo 11.
Wow. So how did NASA say they dealt with that?
Well, according to Dr. Carver's summary of NASA's position, they said they plotted the trajectory very carefully. They aimed to go through the thinnest parts of the belts, and to do it really quickly to minimize the exposure time.
And shielding.
And they claimed the spacecraft itself provided enough shielding.
Enough shielding with 1960s materials and technology. That feels like a key point of doubt for people.
It really does. Dr. Carver brought up a recent study from 2023 that suggested, yeah, survival is possible with the right kind of shielding. But the question lingers, was the shielding back in 1969 truly good enough?
So it becomes less about physics and more about trusting NASA's claims about their own capabilities back then.
Exactly. It's a trust issue.
Okay, what about the lander itself? The Eagle, the lunar module.
Another point of scrutiny, skeptics look at pictures of it and, well, it looks kind of flimsy.
Yeah, Dr. Carver mentioned people describing it like it's covered in aluminum foil. Wall's only 1/8 of an inch thick. How could that survive space travel and landing?
Right. And then there's the landing site itself, underneath the module. Where's the crater?
You'd expect a big hole from the landing engine.
That's the idea. A 10,000-pound thrust engine firing down to slow the descent. Shouldn't that have blasted away a ton of soil, leaving a noticeable crater?
But the pictures show the ground underneath looking pretty flat, undisturbed.
Relatively undisturbed, yeah. And you see these perfectly clear astronaut footprints just nearby. For skeptics, that suggests it wasn't a fiery landing, but maybe the module was just placed there gently.
Placed on a soundstage.
That's the implication. Now, NASA's explanation, as Carver relates it.
Let me guess. The lunar surface again.
You got it. It's not loose dust or sand like a beach. It's densely packed regolith. Hard.
So the engine wouldn't dig in as much.
That's the idea. And also, they throttled the engine way down for the final touchdown. So the exhaust wasn't a concentrated blast straight down. It spread out more, hence no deep crater.
Okay. Again, a technical explanation that asks you to trust their physics over your gut feeling looking at the picture.
Pretty much. It requires accepting their model of how things work on the moon.
All right, let's venture into slightly stranger territory now. This involves a famous film director.
Ah, yes! The Stanley Kubrick theory. This one is, well, it's quite something.
Stanley Kubrick, director of 2001, A Space Odyssey, which came out in 1968, right? A year before the moon landing. And it looked incredibly realistic for its time.
Uncannily realistic. So the theory, the sort of conspiratorial folklore, is that NASA saw 2001 and thought, this guy knows how to make space look real.
So they hired him to secretly direct the faked moon landing footage.
That's the claim. And proponents of this theory look for clues hidden in Kubrick's later films.
Like in The Shining.
Yeah, the little boy, Danny, wears an Apollo 11 sweater in one scene. And then there's the infamous room 237.
What's the connection there?
Theorists claim 237 refers to the distance to the moon, like 237,000 miles. Though Dr. Carver pointed out the average distance is actually closer to 238,000 or 239,000 miles, so the number's a bit convenient.
A bit of a stretch, maybe. What else?
They also point to his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, which deals with secret societies and hidden truths. It came out right around the time of his death in 1999.
Implying maybe he knew too much or was trying to confess something indirectly.
That's the narrative some build around it, yeah, that maybe his death wasn't entirely natural, tying into the whole cover-up idea. Dr. Carver presents this very much as a skeptical theory, showing how intricate these narratives can become. NASA doesn't really engage with this one directly. It's more in the realm of pop culture conspiracy.
It definitely adds a layer of Hollywood drama to it all.
Oh.
Okay, back to more physical stuff. What about the rocks they brought back, the moon rocks?
Right. NASA says they collected a lot, 842 pounds of lunar material over the Apollo missions.
And geologists have studied them.
Extensively. And they confirm the composition is unique. It lacks water. It's rich in specific isotopes like helium-3, things consistent with an origin on the moon, not Earth.
But skeptics aren't convinced.
They push back. They argue, well, some meteorites found on Earth can have similar, though not identical, properties. And they often bring up this specific incident Dr. Carver mentioned.
The one in the Netherlands.
Yeah, apparently a moon rock given to a museum there back in the Apollo era was examined much later, in 2009, and turned out to be petrified wood.
Petrified wood. Seriously.
Seriously. Now, NASA says this was likely a mistake in handling or provenance much later, not related to the actual Apollo samples, but for skeptics.
It casts doubt on all the rocks. If one was fake, maybe others were too. Or maybe they just used meteorites.
Exactly. It fuels the suspicion that the physical evidence might also be fabricated.
And then there's the Soviet Union angle. This one seems tricky for the hoax theory.
It is. You'd think during the Cold War, if anyone had the motive and the means to expose a faked U.S. moon landing, it would be the Soviets.
They were tracking the missions, right? They had their own space program.
Absolutely. They had the capability to listen in, to track the spacecraft. If Apollo 11 never left Earth orbit, they likely would have known.
Yet, they never said a word. They basically acknowledged the U.S. success.
They did. They never publicly disputed it, which is puzzling if you believe it was a hoax.
So how do skeptics explain that?
Well, some of the more elaborate versions of the theory suggest the Soviets were somehow in on it. Maybe there was a secret deal, some quid pro quo with the U.S. to keep quiet.
Wow, that expands the conspiracy massively.
It does. It becomes a global conspiracy, not just NASA. It shows how theories have to adapt to awkward facts, sometimes by getting even bigger.
So, looking at this whole collection of points the flag, shadows, stars, radiation, the lander, the rocks, Kubrick, the Soviets, Dr. Carver kind of summed up what makes the skepticism stick, right?
Yeah, she really emphasized the cumulative effect. It's rarely just one single thing. It's the way these different anomalies and questions stack up.
Like each one adds a little bit more weight to the doubt.
Exactly. And each one requires you to accept NASA's explanation, often a technical one. As Dr. Carver put it, it requires a certain amount of faith in the official account. If that faith is already weak,
then each anomaly reinforces the skepticism.
right.
And that skepticism gets amplified by other things, like missing evidence.
Oh, definitely. Dr. Carver specifically highlighted the lost Apollo 11 tapes, the original telemetry tapes.
The raw data from the mission,
Yeah.
like the best possible record.
Pretty much. The most direct feed of what the spacecraft and the astronauts were doing, the biomedical data, everything. And NASA admitted back in 2006 they couldn't find them. They were likely erased and reused.
Erased and reused the original tapes from the moon landing.
That's what they said. Budget cuts. Poor record keeping in the 70s.
But for a skeptic, that sounds incredibly suspicious. Why lose the single most important record if you have nothing to hide?
It's a huge red flag for them, absolutely. It fits perfectly into a cover-up narrative. It destroyed the primary evidence.
And Dr. Carver also mentioned the human cost. The astronauts.
Yeah, she touched on the fact that several astronauts died in accidents in the years following Apollo, particularly Gus Grissom in the Apollo 1 fire back in '67.
Grissom had been critical of the program's safety, hadn't he?
He had. He famously hung a lemon on the Apollo simulator. And Dr. Carver noted that among some skeptics, there's this whisper, this dark suggestion.
That maybe these deaths weren't all accidents.
That maybe they were ways to silence people who knew too much, people who might expose the alleged hoax. It adds another layer to that shadow she talked about.
Wow. So it becomes this picture of a vast conspiracy involving fake footage, maybe fake rocks, lost evidence, maybe even murder. It goes way beyond just questioning some photos.
It really does.
So what's the bigger picture here? What did Dr. Carver say about the impact of all this skepticism? It's not just about space history, is it?
No, not at all. She sees it as connected to a much broader trend, the erosion of public trust in institutions, government, science, authority figures in general.
She mentioned polling data, right? Trust in government was high back then.
Yeah, around 80% trust in the U.S. government, according to Gallup in 1969, around the time of the landing. And by 2020, it had plummeted to something like 20%.
That's a massive drop.
Yeah.
And Dr. Carver thinks Apollo's skepticism played a role.
She suggests it was kind of an early template. It showed how a major, widely celebrated achievement, backed by official sources, could be effectively questioned and doubted by a significant number of people.
Paving the way for skepticism about other things.
Exactly. She draws a line, suggesting that learning to distrust NASA or the government over Apollo might make it easier to distrust scientific consensus on other issues. Later on, she mentioned things like vaccines or climate change.
Hmm. So if you can convince yourself that was faked, maybe anything from official sources could be.
That's the potential ripple effect she described. It's fundamentally about who you trust and why.
So we've really gone deep here. We've walked through the core claims, the waving flag, the odd shadows, the missing stars, the radiation worries, the look of the lunar module, the missing crater.
The questions about the moon rocks, the whole Stanley Kubrick angle, the Soviet silence, the impact of the lost tapes, even the tragic deaths of astronauts woven into the narrative.
And through Dr. Carver's analysis, we see it's not just about finding flaws. It's about that cumulative doubt, the need for faith in explanations, and how that connects to a bigger picture of trust in institutions.
Yeah, it's clear the controversy itself, whether you believe the hoax theory or not, tells us a lot about society and skepticism.
Right, and maybe a good place to end is with a final thought from Dr. Carver. It really stuck with me. She was asked, what would convince her if she were a skeptic?
And she mentioned things like finding those lost tapes, maybe, or a credible whistleblower coming forward, something really concrete.
Yeah, something definitive. But then she said something quite profound, that the persistence of the moon landing controversy, quote, reflects our doubts back at us.
Reflects our doubts back at us. That's powerful.
It is, isn't it? It kind of turns the question around. It suggests that maybe the reason this theory lasts isn't just about the evidence for or against the landing itself.
It's also about us, about our own general skepticism, our relationship with authority, how we process information, especially extraordinary claims.
Exactly. It challenges you, the listener, to think, why does this narrative resonate? What does its endurance say about our current climate of information and trust?
So regardless of the historical facts of Apollo 11, the controversy itself serves as a mirror.
A mirror reflecting our own complexities, our own questions about belief, evidence, and who we trust in a world just full of competing stories. It's definitely something to think about.